the negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians as to how this conflict ends and under what terms Israel's prime minister earned the right and should have had, quite frankly, the determination to demand a presence at that table. As the old adage goes, Ruth, if you're not around the table, you may well be on the menu.
First, at the moment, currently, of course, the Iranian issue. The second thing is the issue of Gaza. Hamas, as a designated terrorist organization, was not disarmed in any way. The third thing, which is extremely important, is the issue of Turkey.
Focusing in power, and particularly the mind of an American president, on what Prime Minister Netanyahu views as the first order in the priority list, namely the Iranian threat. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Benjamin Anthony Show, a product of the Miriam Institute. There's a lot to get into, and as such, I'm particularly delighted to be joined by one of our most esteemed analysts here at the organization, Ruth Wasserman Lande. Ruth Wasserman Lande, as some of you may know, is a former member of Knesset. She's also the former Deputy Ambassador of the State of Israel to Egypt. She's an Arabist, a prolific publisher in writing, and a regular contributor on Israeli and international media. And I just want to dive straight into what's going on as we record. Namely, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in Washington, D.C. for a meeting with President Donald Trump. And Ruth, it takes me back to a particular time in history where on March 3rd, 2015, the same Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, with a very different president, Barack Obama, took himself, at the invitation of then Speaker of the House John Boehner, to address a joint session of the United States Congress, railing against really a capstone foreign policy initiative of the then president, namely the ratification, soon to be, of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran deal, something that President Trump withdrew the United States from during his first term. And I make mention of that, Ruth, because as Prime Minister Netanyahu made his way down that fabled aisle that splits the House, towards the dais, I was watching in a hotel room and I thought to myself, this Prime Minister, my Prime Minister, when an Israeli Prime Minister travels abroad, I always want that Prime Minister to succeed. I view them as my Prime Minister, regardless of where they're coming from or which party they emanate from. I thought this Prime Minister, my Prime Minister, is going to have to make the speech of a lifetime, of his lifetime, and he actually did so, in my recollection. I remember my heart thumping in my chest with pride as he pressed Israel's case not only to the joint session, but also to the viewing public. Now, here we have a stark contrast. We have a president with whom he is meeting who has withdrawn, as I already mentioned, from the JCPOA, who has fought wing to wing with Israeli pilots, attacking the Iranian ballistic missile program and the nuclear facilities. But there's no fanfare. This is not for the public, although a press conference may eventually take place. You never know. And I wanted to ask you, as a foreign policy expert, what do you want to have Prime Minister Netanyahu say to the president, and what do you think he'll say to the president under the current circumstances and the current tensions?
So first of all, it's a pleasure for me, as always, to be with you, Benjamin, and work with Miriam, and to think about things that are really very, very pertinent to the security, to the resilience, not only of Israel and the Jewish people, but I would even dare say something sort of super dramatic to the Western world. This is my humble opinion, that we are at a crossroad. I do see this visit as very important. Of course, it has repercussions prior to the political elections in Israel, given that Netanyahu needs to show his strong partnership with the United States of America and its current administration and president. However, there are issues, pertinent, significant issues, which I believe will be spoken about and should be spoken about. And I'm not sure how much of the real deal will come out. Certainly there will be statements and declarations made, I think that there will be quite a significant void or difference between the declarative and the real. And what I think the real issue is first, at the moment, currently, of course, the Iranian issue, understanding, or at least I understand, I analyze, I believe, and I see the American constant hitting of the Islamic Republic of Iran, its targets, basically weakening deliberately in a strategic manner, not in a tactical, reactive manner, not in a way which shows that there is no understanding that there is a really big issue in Iran, as many people analyze and say declaratively and so on television, etc., and commentate. I do believe that there is an organized set, I would call it a roadmap, to literally chip away at the abilities and capabilities of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I would have liked it to be quicker, more intense, but then the American administration is not my administration. They have their own interests. They have Hormuz Straits and the stability of the straits and the prices of oil to maintain. And I believe that Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump will try and align the interests, which are at a little bit of a difference, because we want the Iranian regime not weakened, but incapable of hurting Israel, Israeli civilians, Jews throughout the world, and in general, the good of the public worldwide. The Americans, first and foremost, in my humble opinion, want the Straits of Hormuz and the mechanisms of maneuvering energy from one place to another to be free, to be stable, and to be unharmed. And that is not the case at the moment, which brings me to understand that the interests to a significant degree are aligned. That's one thing, not because of the same reason, but because of the same cause. This is number one. The second thing that I would like my prime minister to bring up, that I think is vastly important, and I do believe it will come up, is the issue of Gaza. Hamas, as a designated terrorist organization, was not disarmed in any way. It was significantly weakened, is significantly weakened, but not disarmed. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Fatah combatants are being trained by Egypt in Sinai in some sort of strange preparation to take over, I say in inverted commas, and very ironically, police the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, 70,000 of those Fatah combatants are armed to the teeth and basically serving as an army rather than the 12,000 designated by the Oslo Accords, that are not supposed to be armed in the manner in which they are armed, but rather as a policing force, needing much less armament. And there have been quite a few attacks in the West Bank recently. So this is something that will definitely come up, and I want it to come up because this needs not a perfect solution, because I believe one does not exist at the moment, but at least an answer to the fact that Israeli civilians deserve safety. The third thing, which is extremely important, is the issue of Turkey. And this is an issue on which I believe that there is a bigger difference of opinions and understandings, or rather than opinions, I would say interests. Trump seems to see the president of Turkey as a strong figure whom he sanctioned in his first administration, but at the moment will take care to a significant degree of that part of the region for the American administration. And this is a mistake. I think he is a destabilizing factor, that Syria is no longer Syria, but overtaken by Erdoğan and Turkey, that his eyes are on the oil reservoirs in the land of the Kurds in northeastern Syria, something which is very lucrative and very much of interest to the West as well. But trying to bypass Israel in terms of transporting energy, as the American-Israeli plan has been, to transport energy from the east to the west via Israel, and according to what Trump wants, via Saudi Arabia as well, and not have it bypassed by Syria, by wish and dreams of Erdoğan, who does want to disable Israel in that manner as well. This is a fight not only against nuclear power, against regional powers and military capabilities, but in general, an oil and energy war. This has begun as such with the Islamic Republic of Iran and continues to be such for Trump, especially vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, vis-a-vis Turkey, etc. These issues will come up. And of course, Trump has decided that Saudi Arabia needs to, at least declaratively, possess civilian nuclear capability, something that is of huge, huge significance to the region, because it will begin a competition and a war of who has more in the region, which is extraordinarily dangerous. And what worries me particularly, and this is something that Netanyahu should, and I believe will bring up, is the access, the newly found access of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, even though it's less politically correct to say, Pakistan and Qatar. So the Sunni access as the Shiite one weakens. So it's a very long answer, but to a complex and I would say extremely important and with huge repercussion issue, both for Israel and the United States.
So thank you for all of that. I want to try and touch a couple of those points, and I'm sure that we'll uncover here, as I very much treasure some polite disagreement on some of these points, but always with a view to seeking what might be in the best interest of Israel and the Jewish people and so forth. And I'm sure we'll also uncover some agreement and consensus. So firstly, you have somewhat personal, maybe just adjacent to personal, experience with Erdoğan. I think it was in 2009 that Erdoğan was on the Davos stage with your erstwhile boss, then president of the States of Israel, Shimon Peres. And the viewers and listeners may recall that Erdoğan unleashed this incredible tirade against Israel and then essentially stormed off the stage, thus ripping off the mask of moderation from his face and showing his true colors. Just out of interest, very briefly, were you actually still working with, advising President Peres at that time?
Yes, 2007 to 2009, I was working as advisor for former President Shimon Peres. And indeed, he, unlike himself, usually went out of his way to truly make a statement that I would say expressed his dissatisfaction with that declaration. For me, it was not an unmasking, because Erdoğan is and grew, I would say, on the lap of one of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood. And
Yes.
as an Arabist rather than a Turkolog, the Muslim Brotherhood were founded in Egypt, and this is something which I followed. So for
Yes.
me, the Turkish regime under Erdoğan, even though it was seeking inclusion into Europe, seemingly trying to be moderate and so on, seeking cooperation with Israel at intervals because of economic reasons and so on, which is all fine, legitimate, interest-based. It's international relations, not a love story. But this tyrant of hatred was not new to me. This was not an unmasking, which surprised me.
It
But
was
yes,
a public unmasking. I mean, the general public
yes,
looking
yes,
on.
you're right.
And certainly, they wouldn't even have placed President Perez and Erdogan on the same stage had they known that there was going to be that outburst. I'm quite confident of that. And I remember President Perez sitting there. His hair was somewhat ski-whiff from the headphones that he was listening to the translations by
That's
way of.
right.
It was a very, very interesting interaction, but there's been a precipitous decline in Erdogan's rhetoric, a ratcheting up of his statements against Israel. We saw the terrible mess surrounding the Mavi Marmara, that flotilla, the ship within the flotilla that came to Gaza in violation of a perfectly legal blockade. Our listeners will recall all of that. But I want to talk about Turkey perhaps at another time, because my instinct is that Prime Minister Netanyahu, having watched him over many, many years and having read his autobiography entitled Bibi, My Story, which is far from a complete story because it was, of course, completed prior to the massacre of October 7th and everything that's occurred since then, he was always a big believer in focusing and training. We now realize in error, something that I knew prior to October 7th, we weren't sufficiently trained on the Gaza front, something that I spoke about and wrote about ad nauseum. But he was sedulously trained on the Iran theater, and I believe that he will be in the Oval Office, particularly pressing that. I don't think that he's changed his attitude of focusing in power, and particularly the mind of an American president, on what Prime Minister Netanyahu views as the first order in the priority list, namely the Iranian threat. And I think he's got a challenge afoot, Ruth, if I may. That meeting is said to be attended by Vice President JD Vance. Now, to put it mildly, I believe that JD Vance is antithetical towards the state of Israel. I think that JD Vance has peddled anti-Semitic tropes. I think that Tucker Carlson is actually the mouthpiece of JD Vance. And I don't think that JD Vance has any love for the American-Israel alliance, certainly not in its current constellation. And Vance is doing that which the aggrieved on this world, on this earth, typically do. They're sent to do something, or they attempt to do something. It meets with failure, and so they blame the Jews. And JD Vance went on one of the most popular podcasts anywhere in the world, the Joe Rogan Experience. And on that show, he expressed that the complete disaster that is the memorandum of understanding that he led the charge for and the negotiations for, together with special envoys Witkoff and Kushner, that actually what's undone that is not the porous and frankly pathetic nature of the various clauses on that piece of paper, not the absolute prostrating of the American administration in front of the theocrats of Iran, but in fact, it's an anti-MOU campaign, intelligence campaign wielded by the state of Israel against what JD Vance claims is the mission that he was dispatched to achieve by the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Now, if JD Vance is in that meeting, if the reporting is true, I think that behind the scenes, you're going to see a calling to the carpet of Prime Minister Netanyahu in a manner that is not probably too dissimilar from the way that we saw Zelensky to task, right? I think that that's highly likely. I don't know if Prime Minister Netanyahu is accompanied on this occasion by former Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer. You may know, I don't know. I haven't seen it reported as such, but I know that Dermer, who was something of an indispensable advisor on American affairs and an indispensable emissary of the Prime Minister and a recognized transmitter of the Prime Minister's views when Dermer was ambassador to the United States prior to Yechiel Leiter, and also as Minister of Strategic Affairs subsequently. I don't know whether Dermer is in the room, but I would like to know how you think Prime Minister Netanyahu can disabuse the president of what I imagine is the defense mounted by JD Vance to the same president for this abject and very public failure of what I think all of us, you, me, and anybody who understands the Middle East, realized was a fool's errand, namely trying to negotiate a deal with this regime in Tehran. What do you see the Vance dynamic as adding to the complexity of this meeting?
So first of all, it does add a huge complexity. I absolutely agree with you. And there's no doubt that we are seeing something which is very worrying, and that's an infiltration of the let's say, influence and policies represented by the Islamic Republic of Iran and other very unfriendly factors to the United States, first and foremost. I mean, let's skip Israel for the moment, and begin just with that. Now, there is a camp amidst the current administration supporting that. And we can see that amidst the Republican Party, not only in the left, the progressive left, but also in the right. And this has been in the making for at least a decade, if not more. In my opinion, more than that. There's been a slow, very, very meticulous infiltration. And that infiltration is taking place declaratively, publicly, in different forms. This is only one of the forms. Other forms are different mayors and different other people of significance in various places of a huge importance throughout the United States. And this is a huge challenge, which we and anybody who sees the truth, the good versus the evil, and it may sound completely melodramatic, like a Hollywood production. We even spoke about it, I believe, once or twice prior to this meeting. But this is something that Prime Minister Netanyahu will have to deal with and needs to take into account that it will be an inherent part of anything that he will have to deal with, whether Vance is in the room, which he will be probably in some of the meetings. I don't believe that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu will not have a private meeting over and above that, which will be with others, whether it's on the Israeli side and or on the American side. I don't believe that it's possible at this moment, given the very highly sensitive issues which need to be discussed. Of course, issue number one will be Iran, but it will not be the only one. And at the moment, Vance is specifically connected in terms of his stance and his rhetoric and his, let's say, weight with the failure slash, I would say, he may not see it as a failure at the moment, because let's remind everybody that there's a so-called continued, I put it again, very ironic, but there is a continued negotiation with the Islamic Republic of Iran, as stated declaratively by the president himself. I know that behind the scenes, a 10-point MOU was dispatched initiated by the Iranians, written by Qatar to the American presidency, completely ridiculous, but it is being negotiated. And the question is it really being negotiated, or is this whole thing a strategic, how should we call it, play? And this is something that Benjamin Netanyahu will have to take into account when he delicately walks throughout the mindful room into that meeting. Yes.
So, Ruth, I want to put an idea forward, and bear with me as I describe it. You just made mention of, I think you called them mistakenly the progressive left. I prefer to refer to them as the regressive left, but we can agree to disagree. And the America First right, and what seems to be shaping up somewhat as the Israel Last right, and this horseshoe phenomenon. Now, there's another horseshoe that is taking form and being fashioned in real time, and it's an odd one. After the disengagement in 2005 I actually view it much more as unfortunately, as an expulsion of the population there, specifically given that many of them were not rehoused, were not put back on their feet. It caused an enormous rupture within Israeli society. But after that disengagement under the Sharon administration, there was a very clear decision made by the religious nationalist movement in Israel that such a thing must never occur again. And in order to prevent it from occurring again, they diligently set about enfranchising themselves in two particular areas of national life in Israel. The first was the military. So we see a great many disproportionate number of officers that emanate from the religious nationalist movement. Incidentally, this does not have that negative connotations, this word nationalist, that some of our listeners may be conjuring up in other theatres in other countries. It's thought of as a positive movement, the religious national movement in Israel. They enfranchised themselves within the Israel Defense Forces, specifically in the officers' corps. And they also made sure that they shaped up pretty quickly within politics. Rather than being lobbying groups around the periphery of politics, they started to take up position within the political sphere, forming parties. Now, these parties, the party that reflects that most profoundly right now is led by a problematic individual, Bezalel Smotrich, in my opinion. Is a problematic individual, but there are others who are vying to enter the next Knesset after the elections on October 27th from a similar background. I don't know whether they have any political traction or not, but I'm including people like JD Tropper, who was formerly of Benny Gantz's party, a member of the religious Zionists in terms of his background, upbringing, and education, and Yoaz Hendel, who's no longer a particularly observant individual, but very much comes from that background. And he was Prime Minister Netanyahu's chief of staff, I believe, at a particular period of time. That ended acrimoniously, as tends to be the case with Bibi's chiefs of staff. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning that is that came about as a result of a sense of an historic betrayal among the religious right in Israel, namely the disengagement. In America, Ruth, you have something not dissimilar among the veteran class. The veteran class is split right down the middle by a very prominent schism for those who observe it. And I'm referring to the veterans who were dispatched and deployed to the theaters of Afghanistan and Iraq. And generally speaking, if one listens and consumes what it is that they put out there, one side of that schism feels that the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq were well thought out, well-based, solidly implemented, and essentially a force for and a crusade for good. And then there's another side. And the other side of that schism believes that American blood and treasure was spilled needlessly in an ill-conceived series of campaigns after 9/11. And that side had in its ranks a young veteran, formerly of the US Marines, who was a reporter within the US Marines, not a combat soldier, named JD Vance. And JD Vance enfranchised himself similarly within the political sphere, with his primary goal being ensuring that the American boys and girls, are never dispatched in the cause of a foolish war or a foolish military campaign ever again. So where does this odd horseshoe come about? In the Oval Office, or in the meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, there is an idea that Prime Minister Netanyahu needed to give something in order to get this meeting. And where he gave, and it goes back to your opening statement, was the idea that the ISF, this International Stabilization Force, could start to deploy these troops inside the Gaza Strip in order to bring that elusive stabilization to the enclave there on our southern front in Israel, inside the Gaza Strip. That will have been a thumb in the eye to Smotrich, a thumb in the eye to Smotrich. I don't believe Netanyahu actually has any support within his coalition for anybody taking over the Gaza Strip in that sense. And then on the other side, you've got Vance, who will be saying he does not want America dragged into a needless war on behalf of the state of Israel. And where that horseshoe becomes linked is around what Prime Minister Netanyahu ends up saying in this meeting and extracting from this very meeting. I don't know that people realize that these are the matters at play, but I wonder if you think the Prime Minister has the wherewithal and the political capital at this time to negotiate that minefield, as you called it.
It's a huge minefield, and I'm not sure that I have the perfect answer for you in terms of the weight that he has. The one thing that he does not have is a lot of maneuvering space, not only politically, because as you say, not only his coalition, but his opposition will use it against him if he does give in to some ridiculous force, certainly of armed Fatah operatives going into the Gaza Strip and the IDF going back. That's one. But also, I think that the Israeli public at this time, even that which does not agree with the Netanyahu camp and or coalition, is less forgiving of something like that after October 7th. I think there is more of an understanding on the part of the public in general, not all of it, but in general, despite a lot of criticism of this coalition and the prime minister of leaving Gaza, allowing other forces to enter Gaza, and so on. So I'm not sure that he has a lot of maneuvering space to give in into this issue. And I do foresee that at some point prior to the elections, there will be some action in the Gaza Strip because things have been left untied in that arena. How will he maneuver this within the framework of the current meeting? I have no idea. I mean, Benjamin, this is something that, I would like to have a clearer answer, but this is a real challenge because he will have to give something, as you say. Perhaps the something will be more on the front of Saudi Arabia, despite its civil nuclear project that is being promised, at least declaratively, and so on. But the fear and the threat to the security of the state of Israel and its people is very real on a number of fronts, and certainly and without a question still exists in Gaza, but particularly because it went almost unanswered in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank.
Yeah, and it sounds like your dog over there agrees with this statement that you've just made. Let me try and hit 3 points briefly in the time that remains. The first one is there is a question about whether or not Prime Minister Netanyahu can extract or even wants an endorsement from President Trump during this upcoming run of elections. I wonder if you think that, as was the case during the first Trump administration, I wonder if you think that an endorsement from President Trump today, under these circumstances where it all looks completely confused and unclear and addled and muddled when it comes to American policy toward Iran, do you feel that an endorsement from the American president for Prime Minister Netanyahu is a poison chalice, or is it still something that the Prime Minister should seek to have?
I have no question whatsoever that he wants it, he seeks it, that it will serve to help him in his eyes amidst his supporters, and that he needs this endorsement to be able to maintain the strength, the resilience, this image of the security personality that is playing on the playgrounds of those decision makers in the international arena who are relevant and who are the most important, yes.
Okay, so you believe that it's a positive for him and that he wants to extract that potentially from this meeting?
Yes, again, positive is for a certain audience that is important for him, i.e., his own home audience, home as in his own base of constituency. Yes, it is very important for them.
Okay, because I will tell you that as a voter in Israel and as somebody who, like you and like all of us, frankly, is deeply concerned about what will occur. And you alluded to this in your initial response on this show, on this episode. I am deeply disappointed in my own government about the fact that Israeli pilots have flown wing to wing with American pilots over the skies of Iran, that Israeli operatives, intelligence operatives, have been on the ground for years in Iran in order to facilitate and gather the information and intelligence required for the various bombing raids that have been launched. And most importantly, that Israeli civilians and our citizenry and our civilian infrastructure has had to absorb, by way of ballistic missile fire, successive attacks from Iran onto our sovereign territory, and yet we have allowed ourselves, and I think that this is verging on criminal negligence, not in the literal sense, but just in the political sense, in the leadership sense, that we have allowed ourselves for negotiations, allowed ourselves to look on as negotiations take place in Pakistan, a country that doesn't recognize us, led by a vice president who, as I said earlier, is at the very least antithetical toward Israel, without us being present at the negotiating table. I think that that constitutes a very serious blot on the diplomatic copybook of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I don't think that Israel, or frankly any subsequent Prime Minister of the State of Israel, should ever accept such a standard now or at any point in the future. And so I just wonder how Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to spin the idea of an endorsement by President Trump away from the perception that actually he pretty much quite often is allowed to stray and then brought to heel at the whim of this president. You think he'll be able to differentiate between these two in the minds of the voters?
I think so, yes. I think that his voters want to see an endorsement. They want to see an embrace. It was very difficult for them to hear the statements made by President Trump that were not very complimentary to Prime Minister Netanyahu and to Israel, that we all had stomach aches listening to these statements. I think they want to hear this endorsement. And also there's, I feel that I must also give the sort of opposite analysis, not because it's absolutely correct, but everything is still open. There are many things that are still unknown. And the current situation following October 7th, from a very simplistic military security point of view, is not as pessimistic and terrible as perhaps you had alluded to, in terms of needing to sit out ridiculous negotiation process with a terror supporting country like Pakistan and Qatar, because we are very far from in a perfect position, but we are holding onto more land in Gaza following October 7th and the war that has ensued after the terrible attack there. Again, very imperfect. Hamas is not yet disarmed, but the situation is far more secure for Israel, having a significant buffer zone at this point between our part of the land and Hamas held land. There's relatively little of Gaza that is being held by Hamas. Likewise, with a buffer zone in Syria, which we did not have prior to the Hezbollah attacking us, and the changes that are evident given Al Julani's entrance and the Turkish influence and so on, and the threats that are in existence in Syria against Israel and Israeli civilians in the north. This is a different situation. Also in Lebanon, Hezbollah has been significantly weakened. It's far from perfect. It has not been disarmed. But this is a situation which is completely different to the one that was prior to October 7th. There were attack combative tunnels right up to the almost the living rooms of the villages, the Jewish and Arab villages in the north of the country, Israeli citizens, and Hezbollah was literally on the fence and on the border with almost complete freedom to do whatever, which is crazy in terms of the security situation. That is no longer the case in a very significant manner. Not only that, but we are seeing a different declarative, let's say, ambiance from the current leadership in Lebanon, and that is led by the same American administration, which we all feared and thought would allow the connection that the Islamic Republic of Iran wanted to make with keeping the Straits of Hormuz and negotiating and connecting the Lebanese-Israeli security issue. And the Americans did not allow that. They disconnected, which is an Israeli interest. They did. We had no interest to have this connection made, and it was dismantled. So no, the situation is very far from perfect. We have very many threats. Judea and Samaria, Gaza. We have Egyptians in complete, an unbelievable attempt to expand the military presence and power in the Sinai Peninsula over and above what has been agreed by the agreement with Israel, the peace agreement. We have other issues pertaining to Egypt. We have Lebanon, Syria, Houthis. We have many issues, but there has been steps that can be communicated to the base, the political base of Netanyahu and his government as huge successes, and it would not be very, very unrealistic to have them believe them.
So I know that we have limited time, but we're not under the gun in terms of the time. We're not going to go to a commercial break. So I do want to speak this out because it's very important. Firstly, when I was speaking about how disappointed I am with my prime minister, it could be any prime minister, but after you have these monumental efforts made in broad daylight, not under the guise of plausible deniability, when it is known that the Israeli pilots are over the skies with the Americans, when it's known that our operatives are on the ground in Iran, and when it's known that we're absorbing this ballistic missile fire, I demand that my prime minister is at the negotiating table against that power. I'm not talking about Hamas. I'm not talking about Sisi in Egypt. I'm not talking about Erdoğan. I'm talking about specifically and exclusively the negotiations, however much people may have wanted to tie those to other issues, the negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians as to how this conflict ends and under what terms Israel's prime minister earned the right and should have had, quite frankly, the determination to demand a presence at that table. As the old adage goes, Ruth, if you're not around the table, you may well be on the menu. And I'm concerned that we missed an obligation of leadership in this particular case. Israel in this particular war, in this series of wars, or warlets, if you like, is not the dirty little secret of the international community. It has proudly been there, and we should have been there. Now, I just want to turn for a moment to Gaza. Look, I do not think that our military achievements should go unheralded. I think they're tremendous. I think that they're magnificent. You're right about Lebanon, incidentally, just to turn to that. I remember during my own reserve duty, I think it was around 2011, 2012, we were training up on the northern border for the possibility that there would be an attack launched by these attack tunnels that you just referenced, the seizing of our towns just south of the border with Lebanon, and that the IDF would have to go and extricate our civilians from the capture of Hezbollah. This is something that's gone on for years. I'm very pleased that Israel and the IDF is in there now, holding territory, not in a demilitarized zone, because it can't be demilitarized if there are military personnel in there, but certainly in something that looks like a buffer zone. But with regard to the Gaza Strip, I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu going on and on about how Israel's holding 60% and 70% of the Gaza Strip and so on and so forth, that is cheap politicking at its worst. Because I believe if you go back to where we started and you look at what's coming from the left in America and what's coming from the right in America, the holding of that land without resolution, and specifically the population of Gaza being within that reduced territory, is no asset to the state of Israel. It is purely a diplomatic liability. And here's where I know you and I are going to disagree. I believe that the presence of the Palestinian Arabs inside the Gaza Strip is such a strategic threat to Israel's ability to defend itself that I would actually, please brace yourself, Ruth, because I'm going to say something that I know you will not see eye to eye with me on. I would actually risk kinetic conflict with the Egyptians in order to bring about a situation where the Gazans inside the Gaza Strip, the Gazans, not just Hamas, the Gazan people are relocated away from our border. And before you say, well, that'll just leave them close to our border, but a different border, my firm belief, if you look at the history of Sisi, is that Sisi would promptly move them along and probably disperse them throughout the continent of Africa. I do not think that Israel, and I don't think we owe anything to the Gazans, and I don't think that the outcome of what happened to us on October 7th can be that every Gazan gets a fully furnished, all mod cons apartment to live in a high-rise building sponsored by Jared Kushner and whomever he's doing business with in the UAE or elsewhere. I don't think that we owe anything to the Gazan people. I think we owe it to ourselves to bring about some sort of resolution to this crisis. And boasting, as the Prime Minister does, that we have 60% and it's about to be 70% of the enclave, I am absolutely certain that within the coming few years, that is going to prove a deadly political and diplomatic liability for us, not in any way, shape, or form an asset. Oh, and one more thing before you reply, forgive me. With regard to the Saudis, and maybe we'll put a pin in this and talk about it in more detail next time, I think that the whole notion that we should be pursuing normalization with the Saudis is an overblown notion. If the Saudis, in pursuit of normalization, seek to impose abnormal terms upon Israel, namely that we should even pay lip service now to the partition of Jerusalem and the establishment of a state for the Palestinian Arabs, which will be a failed or terror state against us, I think that if they seek normalization through abnormal terms, they should be shown the door, and the negotiations for that end should not come about.
First of all, you may be surprised, but we don't disagree very, very significantly. The only disagreement that I have with you is that in order to relocate a significant number of people into a territory into which not they want to go, and neither the receiver wants to receive, is an impossible mission. I don't see how that happens. I do agree with you that having that buffer zone is not an asset but a liability, as long as there's a very highly indoctrinated, incited, encouraged to hate population held either hostage or willingly, it doesn't really matter, by a designated terrorist organization like Hamas. It is not a good thing. It is completely imperfect. And we need to think out of the box how to create a resolution to the situation. And I include Judea and Samaria, the West Bank in this, because the 9 miles of the narrow waste of Israel are completely indefensible without more land, behind the green line. Indefensible not in political terms, in ideological terms, in religious terms, in simple military, objective, non-Jewish, non-Israeli terms, just indefensible. And this is something which each government owes its people to defend its civilians. We wanted to do it calmly, with cooperation, with common projects. It didn't work. And it will not work so long as there is incitement and indoctrination. And nobody speaks of that at all. It's not on the radar screen of anybody. And if it will be spoken of, it'll take 20 years to make even a dent in the mentality, culture, and understanding and perception of the people and their hatred towards Israel and the Jews, because that's what they grew up with and that's what they are indoctrinated with. And hence, I have no qualms to agree with you that this is a very far from perfect situation, but we need to be not forgiving and certainly not boastful. I don't connect to, oh, great, we have 60, 70, doesn't matter how much percentage. We need a pathway which is as serving as possible of resolving this completely complex issue in a manner which is resolvable. It is possible, in my humble opinion, to bring that about, to encourage movement of people who are suffering a great deal under Hamas. They are not having fun, even though there is no famine and there is no hunger, and there is certainly no shortage of food because thousands of trucks of foods and commodities are going into the Gaza Strip every single day. And there are videos to show that, not Israeli videos, videos of Palestinians themselves on Instagram showing restaurants and nightlife and so on. But we cannot ignore the fact that a lot of these people are not happy. They're not happy under Hamas. They're not happy with the physical circumstances, and they should be allowed to choose to leave. Where to leave and via which pathway to leave, we need to think very well and creatively about the possibilities. But certainly to leave it as is not even not an asset. It is indeed a liability. I completely agree with you. And it is one of the complexities which the next government will have to deal with, because they won't let go. They say it declaratively, the next October 7th is on its way, whether it's from the Gaza Strip, the Judea and Samaria, Lebanon, Syria. They say it declaratively, openly, proudly. And we learned that we have to take this seriously.
So, Ruth, before I close this episode with the usual compliments, but they're sincere compliments about you bringing your expertise to our listeners, something that we very much appreciate, I just want to make two quick points. Well, one point and a question, actually. First of all, I don't think that there's any evidence that the Gazan people want to stay inside the Gaza Strip. And I think that it is eminently achievable to facilitate the relocation of the Gazans away from Gaza. I'm saying this for a number of reasons, but I want to put forward one that people can't necessarily garner from the newspapers and graphs and charts and polls. I served in this war, as did 300,000 other soldiers, approximately. I served inside the Gaza Strip. I served along what became the Netzarim corridor. I'm also a veteran of a war 20 years prior. It's hard to believe, but I am, the Second Lebanon War. And I saw devastation in southern Lebanon when I walked towards our objective from northern Israel. I saw it. I remember walking through what I can only guess was once a village, and we were up to our waist, literally, in rubble as we walked through it. I'd never seen it. It took me quite a while to understand what we were marching through, and then I realized what it was. The devastation that I saw inside the Gaza Strip is impossible for me to describe. One has to see it in order to understand how extensive it is. It's very important that I re-emphasize that as extensive as it is equally justified and understandable, and in my opinion, proper and appropriate. I'm talking about the infrastructure. The vast preponderance of the Gazan civilians from that aforementioned infrastructure were removed from the area of kinetic operations in order to preserve their lives. Indeed, we're in this quandary, slandered and assailed by the false accusation of genocide. We're in this quandary with the Gazan people precisely because we have successfully moved the vast majority of the Gazans away from the area of kinetic hostilities. And so here they are gathered in particular strongholds, right? 2 points about that. If we have been able to move them since October 7th so successfully, we can move them a little bit further south. I don't believe that it's impossible. I believe it's doable, and I think it's imperative for Israel's long-term security, and I would even say near-term security. And beyond all of that, nobody will convince me that the Gazans, in the destruction that they find themselves in, as a result of people that they supported and regimes that they supported and regimes that they voted for, nobody can tell me that they uniquely among the peoples of this earth want to stay in this squalor, which their own leadership puts upon them.
They don't.
So those are just some points that I want to discuss, and we can talk about that in others, because I know that we are actually now encroaching on the time out here. But I do want to finish with just one question: who are you voting for in the elections, Ruth?
Oh gosh, that's an answer you will not get from me.
All right, we'll talk offline. I thought I would try.
Good
Okay.
try.
All right. Ruth, really, a real pleasure to have you. Thank you so much
Likewise.
for your expertise,
Likewise.
and I look forward to next time. All the very
Likewise.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for watching this episode of the Benjamin Anthony Show here at the Miriam Institute. Listen, if you're watching our content via YouTube, please be sure to hit the subscribe button so that you get all of our analysis as soon as it's published. Leave a question in the comments section so that I know what's on your mind, and I'll do my best to address myself to that during each and every episode, whether that comes from me or from one of my colleagues. I assure you, we will do everything we can to answer what's on your mind. And if you're listening to our content via podcast, please subscribe to the show at wherever it is you download your podcast from, and be sure to leave a rating and review, which really helps us to reach an ever wider audience. Until next time, that's it from me here at the Benjamin Anthony Show.